Shadows in the desert. Weapons smuggled through the Sahara. The desert is a liar. It promises emptiness, just sand, silence, and the occasional skeleton of a truck. But behind that stillness lies movement, invisible movement. Whispers carried by the wind, tracks that vanish by morning, and deals that echo longer than gunfire. During the Second World War, as Europe choked on its own chaos, another war, quieter, stranger, and just as deadly, was being fought here. Across a sea of sand so vast it could swallow countries whole, men smuggled not hope or food, but weapons. Rifles hidden in salt sacks, grenades buried under dates, radios disguised as prayer boxes. To the colonial officers sitting in shaded headquarters in Algiers or Cairo, the Sahara was a natural defense, too vast to cross, too deadly to matter. But to the men who lived in it, the tuareg, the tubo, the traders and wanderers, it was a living map, a shifting network of roots older than empire, older than language itself. And now, those same roots would carry something new, the contraband of modern war. There were no medals here, no parades, only men who spoke in riddles, drove until engines died, and trusted the stars more than their governments. As one smuggler once said, "In the desert, honesty won't feed your camel." And maybe that's why history forgot them, because no one ever writes songs about the men who sold bullets to both sides and still managed to get invited to dinner. But without them, the war in Africa might have looked very different, because behind every general's victory map, there's someone like Ahmed, somewhere in the dunes, quietly counting coins and pretending he just armed both enemies. So tonight, we journey into the desert, into the silence that remembers everything, a silence that hums with engines, secrets, and the distant laughter of men who lived by one rule: trust the sand, not the soldiers.
Act 1. The Empire's Blind Spot. Maps are lies, beautiful ones, but lies nonetheless. To the generals in London and Berlin, the Sahara was just a yellow patch between the colonies, an afterthought, a sandbox with no soldiers. But anyone who'd ever set foot there knew the truth. The desert doesn't care about borders. It laughs at them. When World War II spread into North Africa, strategists planned battles along the coast, Tobruk, El Alamein, Benghazi, where tanks could roll and supply ships could dock. Everything beyond those lines was labeled uninhabitable. Uninhabitable, perhaps, to men with too much paperwork and too little imagination. Because even as Rommel's panzers clawed at the British Eighth Army, the dunes behind them were alive with movement, invisible caravans of smugglers and guides who had been crossing those sands since before the word empire was invented. For them, 1,000 kilometers was not distance, it was opportunity. There was Ahmed El-Kabir from Gadames, once a salt trader, now a logistics consultant, as he liked to call himself. When British officers asked if he could deliver spices to a remote post, he smiled and said, "Of course, but your spices may shoot back." Then there was Fatima Tenderima, a sharp-tongued merchant from Timbuktu who could talk her way past any checkpoint. She sold French officers imported perfumes during the day and sold their ammunition to desert tribes by night. One colonial report called her dangerously charming. Another, more honestly, called her indispensable. While Europe measured war in front lines, Africa measured it in trade routes. And trade in wartime becomes its own weapon. From Morocco's Atlantic ports to the Nile's edge, the old caravan trails revived. Trucks replaced camels, but the rhythm was the same. Travel by night, hide by day. trust the stars more than any compass. Some carried sacks of salt, others crates of Italian rifles stripped of serial numbers. The most successful convoys carried both because you could always trade salt for silence. Meanwhile, colonial officers wrote confident memos. The Sahara remains secure under imperial supervision. If paperwork could fight, the war would have been over by Christmas. But in reality, the empires were blind. Their soldiers guarded roads, their enemies used none. Their forts faced each other, their problems moved between them. And as the armies stared north towards the Mediterranean, the South, the empty South, became a highway of shadows. By 1941, it was common knowledge in desert towns. If you wanted to find the truth, follow the noise of a broken truck engine at night. If you wanted to stay alive, pretend you didn't hear it. The desert didn't belong to any flag. It belonged to whoever could survive it. And that, as it turned out, was rarely the people in uniform.
Act 2. The Desert Brokers. There's an old desert saying, "Only fools fight for free." In the Sahara of 1942, there were no fools, only businessmen. And business was booming. When the Axis and Allies clashed in North Africa, they both discovered a problem. Their supply lines ended at the coast. Everything beyond that? A vast, shimmering nothingness patrolled by men who didn't care which flag you saluted as long as you paid in gold or gasoline. The war may have been about ideology in Europe, fascism, freedom, empire, but out here, it was about logistics. Who could move what, through where, and without getting shot by either side on the way? That's where the desert brokers came in, a loose brotherhood of traders, translators, and professional liars who could make the impossible happen for the right price. There was Abdallah ben Fadil, the gentleman smuggler of Fezzan, known for his impeccable manners and complete lack of conscience. He'd sell rifles to a French garrison in the morning, dine with their commander at noon, and sell the same rifles, slightly used, to rebels by sunset. When a British agent accused him of profiteering, Abdallah smiled and replied, "No, my friend, I am simply helping both sides lose money equally." Or Madame Yamina al-Sudani, a cafe owner in Agadez who ran a thriving black market empire behind her teapots. Every evening, her bar filled with soldiers, smugglers, and spies, none realizing that she kept two sets of ledgers, one for the drinks and one for the weapons. If you asked for extra sugar in your tea, it meant you wanted ammunition. If you asked for a quiet night, you wanted explosives. The Allies had their informants, the Axis had theirs, but everyone, and I mean everyone, relied on the brokers. They were the desert's postal service, courier company, and black market Amazon rolled into one. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't salute, but generals, soldiers, and rebels alike all waited on their deliveries. And while nations debated morality, the brokers debated markup. A case of Lee Enfield rifles, 300 pounds if you were French, 250 if you were German, 100 if you were local, or free if you could trade 2 barrels of fuel and promise not to shoot the delivery driver. They navigated through sandstorms that could erase a man's past, and outpost checkpoints where soldiers too bored to fight were happy to take bribes instead. In one case, an Italian officer stopped a convoy of medical supplies bound for Chad. Inside, 40 boxes of British ammunition. The convoy leader just shrugged and said, "Doctor's orders." The officer let them go. He probably bought a few boxes for himself. Meanwhile, in Cairo, MI6 agents were trying to make sense of the chaos. They intercepted coded telegrams like "shipment of carpets delayed by sand" or "dates spoiled, request more salt." What they didn't realize was that carpets meant rifles, dates meant grenades, and salt meant spare parts for tanks. For every crate that reached the front, 3 more vanished into the desert's economy of shadows. And while nations counted victory in battles, these men counted it in profit margins. Because in the Sahara, loyalty was a commodity, and business, as they say, was good.
Act 3. The Colonial Mirage. Empires have a habit of believing their own propaganda. The French believed the Sahara was tamed. The British believed it was secured. And the Italians, well, they believed they'd inherited Rome's desert glory. None of them believed in the one truth every nomad knew: the desert can't be owned. To the colonial powers, the Sahara was a blank space. No borders, no cities, no reason to care. They saw it as nature's firewall, vast, hot, and inconvenient. Perfect for keeping rebels out and soldiers in. But beneath that illusion, the desert was alive, a slow, quiet rebellion powered by trade, rumor, and the art of pretending to obey. The French in Algeria built outposts so remote that even their own supply columns sometimes couldn't find them. An officer once radioed Paris saying, "We control 300 kilometers of territory." A local replied, "Yes, but which 300? It moves every day." The Italians were worse. Mussolini's dream of a new Roman Africa came with maps drawn in Rome by people who thought sand dunes stayed in one place. Italian surveyors went mad trying to measure them. By the time the ink dried on a map, the desert had already edited it. The British, smug as ever, thought they'd cracked the code. If they couldn't patrol the desert, they'd pay someone else to do it. They hired Tuareg and Tubu guides as loyal scouts. The problem? Those scouts also worked for the French, the Italians, and occasionally themselves. A British officer once asked a Tuareg guide, "Whose side are you on?" The guide smiled and said, "The winning one, inshallah." Back in London and Paris, colonial offices issued thick reports full of confidence. Desert regions remain under firm administrative control. That was bureaucrat speak for, "We have no idea what's happening." While the generals drew arrows on maps, smugglers were driving under their noses, sometimes literally. Entire convoys crossed secure zones while officers in starched uniforms debated whether camels could carry explosives. They could, and did. The mirage of control stretched beyond military arrogance. Propaganda films showed smiling colonial troops marching in neat lines. What they didn't show were the nighttime desert meetings between those same troops and local traders, swapping rations for bullets. By day, the colonials enforced order. By night, they bought it back. Every empire's greatest enemy was not another empire, it was the invoice they couldn't explain. One French administrator wrote in his diary, "We seem to be paying the same smuggler twice." A British colonel scribbled a note, "Unclear who our guide is working for, possibly everyone." And an Italian general simply wrote, "The sand is mocking me." The desert became a comedy of errors wrapped in a tragedy of ambition. By 1942, the great colonial powers, each convinced of their superiority, had turned the Sahara into a giant roulette table where every spin cost lives, fuel, and dignity. Meanwhile, the locals watched and waited. They'd seen conquerors come and go: Romans, Ottomans, French, British, Italians. Only the sand remained undefeated. And in that sand, weapons and whispers traveled freely, the only currency the empires couldn't tax.
Act 4. The Smuggler's Code. The desert doesn't run on governments. It runs on rules. Not written ones. Those blow away in the wind. No, the Sahara had its own code, enforced not by courts or soldiers, but by thirst, fear, and the quiet knowledge that a man who breaks his word in the desert doesn't last long enough to regret it. They called it the Smuggler's Code. Not a code of honor, exactly, more a list of bad decisions you only make once. Rule number 1, don't lie to the man who knows where the water is. Rule number 2, if you steal from someone, don't expect to live long enough to spend it. Rule number 3, if the sand starts whispering, leave. That's not the wind. In this strange economy of heat and deceit, men like Hassan the Fox Jamous thrived. He'd been a driver for French postal convoys before the war, then realized he could make more money smuggling British fuel to Italian garrisons, and even more selling it back to the British afterward. He wasn't greedy, he explained, just multilingual in opportunity. Hassan believed in fairness. If two sides were willing to kill each other, he reasoned, the least he could do was make sure they both had enough bullets. When a British captain tried to arrest him, Hassan offered a half grin and said, "Captain, I am simply speeding up the war for everyone." There was Fatou al-Hamid, a truck mechanic who refused to join any army but could fix anything with an engine. She ran her own mobile repair service across the dunes, which mostly involved fixing trucks in exchange for gossip. Once, she traded a carburetor repair for a crate of whiskey, which she promptly sold to a French officer who thought he was buying aviation fuel. When the officer's Jeep didn't start the next morning, she shrugged and said, "Whiskey burns too, if you believe in it enough." The smugglers weren't saints, but they weren't villains either. In the desert, morality was like water. Everyone wanted it, but no one could afford to waste it. There were alliances made under stars and betrayals sealed by sunrise. Some smugglers worked for the Axis one week and the Allies the next, adjusting their loyalties based on who was buying diesel. Others swore oaths of neutrality, which usually lasted until someone offered a better deal. But amid all the chaos, one truth stood firm. A man's word was worth more than gold. Because in the Sahara, gold couldn't find you water. But a reputation, a name whispered with respect, that could keep you alive. Those who broke the code were dealt with quietly. No trials, no shouts, just a disappearance. A truck found burned out in the dunes. A lone pair of boots, half buried in sand. The desert doesn't need executioners. It has eternity. Still, the smugglers weren't without humor. One of them once wrote on the side of his truck, "Express delivery, no questions, no refunds." Another painted a slogan in Arabic on his cargo hold, "We don't smuggle lies, only goods." They were part criminals, part heroes, and part philosophers, men and women who could laugh at the absurdity of it all while outrunning soldiers, sandstorms, and their own consciences. The irony was that both sides of the war relied on them. Without smugglers, Allied fuel wouldn't reach forward units. Without smugglers, Axis radios would die silent in the heat. Even the resistance movements, the real heroes, were armed by the same hands that supplied their oppressors. And so the desert carried on, full of laughter, deals, and ghosts. Each night, fires flickered in the dunes as convoys paused to rest, engines cooling, drivers sipping tea, brewed with more sugar than sense. Someone would tell a joke about Mussolini's maps. Someone else would swear that the Germans were paying in counterfeit gold again. And then the laughter would fade into the sound of wind carrying another secret into the endless dark. Because in the Sahara, you didn't survive by being brave. You survived by being useful. And in that sand, weapons and whispers traveled freely, the only currency the empires couldn't tax. Act 5.
The axis in the sand. When German intelligence heard rumors of smuggler routes cutting across North Africa, they didn't see danger, they saw opportunity. The Italians saw it too, though they imagined it would be easier than it was. After all, what was a few thousand kilometers of sand to the descendants of Rome? A lot, as it turned out. By 1941, the Abwehr, German military intelligence, had begun sending agents into North Africa, not soldiers in uniform, but men disguised as traders, scientists, even archaeologists. Their mission was simple on paper: establish contacts with desert tribes, create supply networks, and use the Sahara as a back door to smuggle weapons and fuel south toward pro-Axis forces. It was a brilliant plan in Berlin. It was a death sentence in the desert. The Sahara had no patience for bureaucracy. Convoys vanished, radios failed, compasses lied. An Italian officer once wrote in his journal, "The wind here sounds like it's laughing at us." Still, the Axis persisted. Italian trucks painted with medical relief symbols carried crates of ammunition disguised as morphine shipments. German field agents met smugglers in remote oases offering gold coins and promises of a new order that would reward loyal tribes. But the tribes had heard that one before from the Ottomans, the French, the Spanish, and the British. The desert doesn't do loyalty, it does business. One famous story tells of Operation Sonnenthad, Sun Path. A small German team, led by Hauptmann Kurt Reiner, was tasked with establishing an intelligence post in southern Libya. They made it as far as Merzouk before realizing the nearest water well had dried up years earlier. When asked how they survived, the local tribesmen who found them said, "They didn't, their truck did." Meanwhile, Mussolini, sitting comfortably in Rome, bragged about his invincible desert empire. He sent more men, more trucks, more equipment, and received fewer reports. By the time word reached him that several convoys had vanished without trace, the desert had already claimed them, body and soul. Even the Germans, masters of precision, learned humility. A Luftwaffe intelligence officer noted that our maps are works of fiction. His counterpart in Berlin replied, "Then you'll feel right at home. We publish fiction every day." Still, not everything the Axis attempted failed immediately. Some smugglers saw profit in their desperation. They sold them outdated British rifles, fake spare parts, even sand disguised as cement. One Italian quartermaster tried to build an airstrip using this cement. When the first plane landed, it disappeared halfway through the runway. By 1942, Rommel's Africa Corps was retreating westward, and the so-called Saharan Bridge had collapsed. The desert didn't need bombs or bullets to win. It had thirst, distance, and time. Somewhere near Kufra, an abandoned German truck was found decades later, still perfectly preserved by the dry air. Inside was a single message scribbled in pencil: "No more sun, no more sand, no more maps." The author wasn't recorded. The desert doesn't keep receipts. The irony? While the Axis struggled to survive, the same smugglers they tried to bribe were busy selling their fuel to British patrols at double the price. Even in defeat, the desert made sure someone got paid.
Act 6. The Allies Strike Back. By 1942, the Allies had started to realize something important. You can't outfight the desert, but you can learn to speak its language. Rommel's tanks were running out of fuel, the Italians were running out of luck, and the British were running out of patience. In Cairo, a new kind of soldier emerged, one that didn't fit the mold of parade ground discipline. They were scruffy, sunburned, and allergic to authority. They were the Long-Range Desert Group, LRDG, explorers turned commandos who swapped maps for instinct and uniforms for practicality. Their unofficial motto? If you're still clean, you're not far enough from headquarters. These men could fix an engine with a spoon, navigate by starlight, and make tea in a sandstorm, all while being shot at. They drove thousands of miles behind enemy lines in open-top trucks, gathering intelligence, ambushing supply lines, and generally making the Axis wish they'd stuck to Europe. Their closest allies weren't generals, but smugglers. Local guides, men who once moved contraband across the dunes, now guided Allied patrols the same way, through silence, shadows, and starlight. One LRDG officer wrote, "We were trained by men who didn't need compasses. They could smell north." Meanwhile, deep in French-controlled Chad, a certain General Philippe Leclerc was leading the Free French forces on a campaign so daring it bordered on madness. He had a ragtag army of African troops, outdated vehicles, and more enthusiasm than equipment. His orders? March north and strike at Italian strongholds like Kufra, hundreds of miles away across one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. When told it was impossible, Leclerc reportedly laughed and said, "So is France without freedom. Let's go." His men didn't just fight, they adapted. They traded with local tribes for food, paid smugglers for maps, and occasionally bribed Italian sentries with cigarettes and stories about Mussolini's bad poetry. In one infamous encounter, an Allied patrol intercepted a convoy carrying both British ammunition and German rations. When asked who they worked for, the convoy leader replied, "Whoever eats first." The desert didn't judge, it just watched. The Allies, now seasoned by sun and humility, learned to blend in with the chaos. They used captured Axis trucks, spoke broken Arabic, and relied on rumors carried by caravan gossip more than official dispatches. A supply mission might begin with orders from London and end with a bribe in Fezzan. If the paperwork didn't match the result, well, as one officer quipped, that's what classified means. The LRDG operated like ghosts, their engines muffled, their movements unpredictable. They struck from nowhere, vanished into sandstorms, and reappeared days later with trophies and intelligence no one could explain. But not all of it was glory. For every successful raid, there were those who simply never came back. Sometimes the only sign of their existence was a half-buried vehicle discovered years later, canteens still full, logbooks still open to the last entry. Sand. Endless sand. Yet for all the loss, there was humor, the kind only found among men who'd spent too long under a burning sun. One British driver painted on his truck, "If found, return to owner, preferably alive." Another scribbled a note in his diary, "The desert is large, my patience isn't." As 1942 bled into 1943, the tide of war began to shift. The smugglers who had once sold to both sides now found business better with the Allies. They paid in cash, not promises. And as Allied columns pushed westward, they followed the same ghost roads that smugglers had built, trading bullets for trust and control for cooperation. The desert hadn't been conquered, but it had been understood. And in a war full of arrogance, that was victory enough. Act 7. The Desert Radio War. They say the desert has no sound. That's not true. It hums softly, endlessly with the wind, the shifting dunes, and during the war, with something new: radio static. By 1942, both the Axis and Allies had learned that whoever controlled the airwaves controlled the desert. It wasn't just about guns anymore. It was about voices in the dark, bouncing between dunes, pretending to belong. Every army had spies, but here, everyone was a frequency away from becoming one. The British had their listeners, the Italians had their wireless observers, and the Germans had their elegant term Nachrichtenaufklärung signals intelligence. The smugglers called them all men who talk too much. You could always tell a new radio operator from the veterans.
The new ones spoke like they were in an office. The veterans whispered like they were talking to ghosts. Because out here, they were. The radio war began quietly, a few coded messages bouncing across frequencies. But as the desert filled with patrols and smugglers, the airwaves became as crowded as a Cairo marketplace. Sometimes you could pick up 3 languages on the same channel: German orders, British weather reports, and a smuggler trying to sell a goat. There were no clear lines. Messages intended for Alexandria ended up in Tripoli. Encrypted broadcasts from Berlin were intercepted in Khartoum. One French intelligence officer once said, "The desert speaks all tongues, but none clearly." And yet, in that chaos, brilliance bloomed. British listening posts, some hidden in ancient forts, others disguised as trading stations, began tracking faint signals late at night. Operators hunched over static-filled receivers, tuning in like fishermen waiting for a bite. The click of the Morse key became as common as the rattle of a canteen. One operator, Sergeant Leonard Sparks Granger, once bragged he could tell a man's nationality by how impatiently he tapped his messages. He said, "The Germans tap like they're giving orders. The Italians tap like they're conducting opera. And the British? We tap like we're asking for tea." Not to be outdone, German agents began broadcasting fake British signals, tricking Allied patrols into ambushes. The Allies retaliated by sending phantom transmissions, coded nonsense designed to waste Axis fuel chasing imaginary convoys. One of these transmissions famously ordered a shipment of 200 camels with wings. An Italian radio officer spent 3 days trying to decode it before realizing it was a joke. Meanwhile, smugglers, ever resourceful, began using radios to their advantage. They'd intercept military signals, learn where convoys were headed, and get there first. Some even sold information to both sides, transmitting under false call signs. The desert became a strange orchestra of deceit, radios humming, voices cutting in and out, the occasional curse in half a dozen languages when sand fried the batteries. Every message risked exposure. Every silence risked death. Sometimes, patrols would track a signal for days, only to find an empty truck, the operator gone, the radio still broadcasting a looped message. All clear, all clear, all clear. In one case, a German listening post detected what they thought was an Allied distress call. They triangulated the position and sent help. They found an old smuggler sitting alone beside a campfire with a broken radio and a mischievous grin. He'd been using the distress frequency to lure rescuers and sell them supplies. "Business is slow," he told them, "but God bless your sense of duty." As the months went on, both sides realized the air was haunted, not by ghosts, but by the echoes of messages that refused to die. Frequencies would sometimes pick up voices long after their senders had vanished. Desert lore grew around it. Some said the wind itself had learned Morse code. Others claimed to hear dead operators tapping SOS into eternity. Even today, desert travelers swear that on still nights, if you tune an old radio just right, you can hear it. Faint, distant, but real. The crackle of forgotten war, the hum of courage and confusion, the voice of a world that never stopped whispering.
Act 8. The Fire Beneath the Sand. When the guns of the great powers fell silent, the desert did not. It had learned something from their chaos, how to turn a whisper into a roar. By 1943, the Sahara was littered with relics, broken trucks, discarded helmets, and crates of weapons buried for
later. The soldiers who'd carried them home had moved on to Europe, Asia, the Pacific. But in the dunes of Africa, later was about to arrive. For decades, colonial governments had ruled through fear, disarming tribes, taxing caravans, and declaring independence movements illegal dreams. But now, hidden beneath the dunes, lay the tools those dreams needed. The desert, once the empire's hiding place, had become its armory. In northern Niger, a nomadic clan uncovered a half-buried truck. German markings faded, but its cargo intact. Inside, rifles, ammunition, and a note written in German and Italian that no one could read. They didn't need to. They understood exactly what it meant: power. A few hundred kilometers west, in Mali, French colonial troops began reporting bandits armed with surprisingly modern weapons. The officers were confused. Bandits, the locals replied, don't usually have matching ammunition. The war had changed Africa in ways Europe could not comprehend. Men who had served as colonial soldiers returned home with training and resentment. They had seen European armies bleed. They had carried their guns, fixed their trucks, and buried their dead. And they had realized something dangerous. Empires could die. So when word spread that there were rifles hidden in the desert, the same rifles once used to fight over Africa, those men didn't hesitate. They went looking. At first, it was small. A skirmish near an outpost, a missing patrol, a flag painted over with a tribal symbol. But then it grew. In Algeria, whispers spread of resistance fighters using old German MG-34s. In Chad, Tuareg bands rode across old smuggler trails, striking colonial convoys. In Sudan, stolen British grenades made their way into rebel camps. The smugglers, of course, adapted. They sold to anyone who could pay, and sometimes to those who couldn't, out of sheer respect. Businessmen, yes, but also accidental revolutionaries. One old trader was once asked if he felt guilty arming rebels. He shrugged and said, "The British sold the rifles, I just delivered the receipts." And so the lines blurred again, as they always did in the Sahara. Freedom and profit, rebellion and routine, all wrapped in the same dust. It wasn't all triumph. The colonial powers hit back, hard. Air raids thundered over villages that had no radios. Soldiers stormed towns looking for foreign guns, and anyone caught with ammunition was branded a traitor. Yet the desert couldn't be bombed. The sand swallowed the evidence. The wind erased the footprints. In one French report from 1944, a frustrated officer wrote, "They appear, they vanish, they are everywhere and nowhere. The desert protects them." He wasn't wrong. Years later, when independence movements began sweeping through Africa, many of the first leaders were men who had once fought or traded in these same sands. Some had been drivers, some smugglers, some soldiers who'd gone home with stories and secrets and a rifle hidden behind the family hut. And when they rose to speak against colonial rule, their enemies dismissed them as uneducated. But the desert had educated them better than any university. It had taught them patience, it had taught them silence, and it had taught them that everything buried eventually comes back. The rifles smuggled across the Sahara during the Second World War had outlived the war itself. They had outlived empires, and they had given birth to something stronger, a continent that refused to stay quiet any longer.
Act 9. The Disappearing Roads. The desert keeps secrets better than any spy. It doesn't need a safe, a password, or a vault, just time. Give it a few years, and even the loudest war becomes silence. When World War II ended in 1945, Europe celebrated. Flags waved, parades filled the streets, and governments wrote victory speeches faster than they could rebuild their cities. But no parades marched for the Sahara. No medals were pinned for surviving a place where even shadows melted by noon. The men who had fought, traded, smuggled, and died here simply went home, or disappeared into the dunes as if the war itself had imagined them. For a few years, trucks still crossed the old routes carrying leftover supplies and refugees trying to start over. Then, slowly, the roads began to fade. The sun cooked the tire tracks until they became dunes again. Wells ran dry. Caravan stations, once full of life and laughter, turned into empty shells rattling with wind. In Ghadames, an abandoned fuel depot became a meeting place for scavengers. In Agadez, children found rusted bullets in the sand and used them as marbles. In Murzuk, a trader discovered a skeleton inside an old truck, its bones bleached white, still holding a map. The map, of course, was blank. Reports from colonial officers trickled back to Europe, vague, impersonal, and utterly detached from the reality of the place. Minor unrest among local tribes. Unconfirmed movements along trade routes. Native activity under observation. What they really meant was, we have no idea what's happening, and the desert refuses to explain itself. The smugglers who survived the war found that peace was bad for business. No one needed to pay double for bullets anymore. Some went legitimate, opening small shops or becoming tour guides for bored European archaeologists who wanted to discover ruins the locals had been living next to for centuries. Others stayed in the shadows. There were rumors of men who could still move anything across the desert, no longer for empires, but for whoever had the gold. One British intelligence officer dryly remarked, "We may have left Africa, but our problems seem to have stayed behind." The irony? Many of the routes used in the post-war smuggling of salt, cigarettes, and even people were the same ones first mapped during the war. The desert remembered its trade, even if the world didn't. But the biggest loss wasn't the cargo or the maps, it was the memory. The war in the Sahara wasn't officially documented. It didn't fit the narrative. It had no front lines, no heroes, no clear villains. Historians focused on Europe and the Pacific. Textbooks skipped straight from El Alamein to D-Day, as if nothing of consequence had ever happened in between. And so the desert returned to what it had always been, a blank space on someone else's map. Yet for the people who lived there, the ghosts never left. Old men in oases still told stories of nights when the stars were drowned out by the sound of engines. Women who once traded food for bullets still whispered about the war that never ended. And every now and then, the sand would give up one of its treasures, a rusted weapon, a dented canteen, a dog tag with no country left to claim it. The dunes may move, but they never forget. They just wait, patient, ancient, indifferent, until someone listens. Maybe that's why history forgot them. Because the desert doesn't care for applause. It only remembers the footsteps of those who were foolish enough to walk it and brave enough to come back.
Act 10. The Shadows Remember. The war ended, but the desert didn't get the memo. While the world moved on, while Europe rebuilt, America celebrated, and new borders carved up old dreams, the Sahara stayed silent, unchanged. But silence is not emptiness, it's a kind of memory. Beneath the dunes lie 1,000 stories. Men who fought and never returned. Women who traded secrets for survival. Traders who switched sides so often they forgot which one they started on. And every once in a while, the desert decides to tell one of those stories again. In 1978, a shepherd in southern Libya found a rusted crate after a storm. Inside were British rifles, still oiled, still ready. Beside them, wrapped in faded cloth, a handwritten note in French. Pour ceux qui reviendront, for those who will return. He took one rifle home, not to fight, but to hang above his doorway. He called it the desert's souvenir. Elsewhere, a young archaeologist in Niger uncovered a crushed Italian helmet half buried in an old riverbed. It still had a bullet hole through the top. Inside, she found a scrap of paper with coordinates scribbled in pencil, coordinates that led nowhere. And yet, these fragments began to piece together a truth that history had overlooked, that between the lines of empire and conquest, the desert had hosted a war of its own. Not a war of armies, but of people. People who didn't wear medals or uniforms, who didn't have anthems or parades, but who fought all the same, for survival, for freedom, or sometimes just for a full stomach. Over time, historians began to look closer. They found forgotten reports, untranslated diaries, and abandoned outposts swallowed by sand. Each discovery rewrote a sentence the textbooks had skipped. The smugglers became early logisticians. The traders became intelligence couriers. The bandits became the first whispers of independence. And in a strange way, they all shared one victory. They outlived their conquerors. Still, the desert never gave up all its secrets. It kept a few for itself. If you travel through the Tenere today, you'll see rusted metal glinting under the sun, an old canteen, a wheel rim, maybe a fragment of a propeller. To most travelers, they're relics. To the wind, they're monuments. Sometimes at night, truck drivers swear they see moving lights on the horizon, long lines of lanterns that vanish when approached. The elders say it's the ghosts of old caravans, still crossing, still trading, still carrying things no one dares name. Maybe it's just mirage, or maybe, just maybe, the desert is still running its own little business. Because that's the thing about history. You can bury the facts, you can silence the voices, but you can't stop the wind. And out here, the wind remembers everything. The desert never cared who won the war, but it remembers who walked across it. Those men and women, smugglers, soldiers, rebels, traders, they're gone now, but their footprints are not. They're just hidden, waiting for another storm to reveal them. And maybe, one day, when someone stumbles across an old bullet or a rusted can, they'll realize the Sahara was never empty. It was just waiting for someone to listen. History is not made by the ones who are remembered. It's made by those who were never supposed to be found. The Sahara's secret war was never about nations or medals. It was about human survival, courage, and the quiet defiance of people the world forgot. Here, beneath the dunes, weapons became voices, smugglers became legends, and shadows became history. This was the war without glory, but also the war without lies. Because the desert, unlike men, never pretends. Hidden Frontlines, bringing forgotten courage back to life. If this story moved you, share it. Help bring these untold histories to light. Subscribe for more cinematic documentaries that uncover the human side of war, where silence speaks and the past still breathes.